The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels as Eliza clutched her meager possessions to her chest. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the Kansas prairie, and sweat beaded on her forehead beneath the worn brim of her bonnet. She had been traveling for 3 days now, each mile taking her further from everything she had ever known and closer to a fate she could barely comprehend. The letter in her pocket, creased and yellowed from countless readings, contained the terms of an arrangement that would save her from destitution, but cost her something far more precious: her freedom. Her father had died that spring, leaving behind nothing but debts and a small plot of land that the bank had already claimed. With no relatives to speak of and no marketable skills beyond tending house and garden, Eliza had faced a future of either starvation or worse. The advertisement in the local paper had seemed like Providence itself. Widowed rancher seeks wife for companionship and household management. Generous compensation for the right woman. She had responded with trembling hands, knowing that she was essentially selling herself to survive, but seeing no other path forward. The journey west had been a blur of endless prairie, uncomfortable nights sleeping in hay-filled wagon beds at roadhouses, and the constant gnawing anxiety about what awaited her. She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk: her mother's wedding dress, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a few books that had survived her father's creditors, and the simple clothes that would have to serve her in this new life. The weight of her desperation pressed against her chest like a stone, making it difficult to breathe as she contemplated the bargain she had struck. Every morning for the past 3 days, she had awakened with the same thought. She was trading herself like a commodity, selling her body and her future to a man she had never met. The shame of it burned in her throat, but the alternative was worse. She had seen what happened to women with no money and no protection. They ended up in the brothels or dead in alleyways, forgotten by a world that had no use for them. At least this way she would have shelter, food, and the respectability of marriage, even if it came at the cost of everything she had once dreamed of. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Pete who spoke little but chewed tobacco constantly, spat into the dust and pointed ahead. "There's the Broken Arrow Ranch," he said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over wind and horses. "Thomas Blackwood's place. You sure about this, miss? Ain't too late to turn back. I could take you back to Topeka. No questions asked." Eliza's heart hammered as she saw the sprawling ranch house in the distance, flanked by weathered barns and corrals filled with cattle. Smoke curled from the chimney, and she could make out figures moving about the yard. This would be her new home, whether she wanted it or not. The weight of her circumstances pressed down on her like a physical force, but she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had made her choice, and she would see it through with whatever dignity she could muster. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I've come this far. There's nothing left for me back there anyway." Pete nodded and continued driving, but she could feel his concerned glances as they approached the ranch. The closer they got, the more impressive the operation appeared. This was no struggling homestead, but a thriving enterprise with well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, and signs of prosperity everywhere she looked. Whatever else Thomas Blackwood might be, he was clearly a successful man. The thought both comforted and terrified her in equal measure. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Eliza found herself face to face with her future. Thomas Blackwood stood on the porch, his hands clasped behind his back, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and work-hardened hands that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his clothes, while simple, were well made and clean, but it was his face that made her breath catch. The left side was marred by old burned scars that pulled at his skin, creating a mask of permanently damaged flesh that extended from his temple to his jaw. He descended the steps slowly, his boots making hollow sounds on the wood. When he reached the wagon, he removed his hat and held it in front of him, a gesture that seemed both formal and protective. "Miss Eliza Carter, I presume," he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. "I trust your journey wasn't too difficult." "It was manageable, thank you," she replied, accepting his offered hand as she climbed down from the wagon. His grip was firm but gentle, and she noticed that he was careful not to turn the scared side of his face toward her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a deep brown, filled with an intelligence that seemed at odds with his obvious self-consciousness about his appearance. I appreciate you sending for me, Mr. Blackwood, and for the advance payment that made the journey possible. Thomas, he corrected, taking her small trunk from Pete and paying the driver with coins from his vest pocket. We'll be husband and wife soon enough. No need for formalities. He paused, then added more quietly, I hope the arrangement will prove satisfactory to both of us. The words sent a chill through her despite the warm afternoon. Husband and wife. The reality of what she had agreed to was settling in like a weight in her chest. She had traded her freedom for security, her independence for survival. But as she looked around at the well-maintained ranch, the healthy cattle, and the obvious prosperity of the operation, she reminded herself that she had made the only choice available to her. Thomas led her into the house, and Eliza was surprised by what she found. The interior was clean and well appointed, with handcrafted furniture and windows that let in streams of golden light. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the kitchen. It was far more welcoming than she had dared to hope. The floors were polished wood, covered with braided rugs in warm colors, and the walls were adorned with simple but tasteful decorations. It spoke of a man who valued comfort and beauty, even if he lived alone. I've prepared the spare room for you, Thomas said, setting her trunk down near the stairs. We'll be married by the circuit preacher when he comes through next week. Until then, you're welcome to familiarize yourself with the house and the routines. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring ranch has been helping with the cooking and cleaning, but she'll be leaving once you're settled. That's very considerate, Eliza said, though her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. I suppose we should discuss the arrangements. What exactly will be expected of me? Thomas turned away, presenting his unmarked profile to her. I need someone to manage the household, prepare meals, and tend to the domestic concerns. In return, you'll have security, comfort, and a home. Nothing more complicated than that. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. I should be clear about one thing, Miss Carter. This is to be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You'll have your own room, your own space. I won't make demands on you that weren't part of our agreement. But Eliza sensed there was much more to it than he was saying. She had seen the loneliness in his eyes, the careful way he positioned himself to hide his scars, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke of marriage. This was a man who had been wounded in more ways than one, and she found herself wondering what had brought him to this arrangement as surely as desperation had brought her. Over the following days, Eliza settled into the rhythms of ranch life. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Thomas and the handful of ranch hands who worked the property. She tended the vegetable garden, mended clothes, and kept the house spotless. The work was familiar and oddly comforting, providing a structure to her days that helped keep her anxiety at bay. Thomas was unfailingly polite but distant, speaking to her only when necessary and always keeping his scarred face turned away. She learned his story in fragments, gathered from overheard conversations with the ranch hands and careful observations. He had been married before, to a woman named Sarah who had died in the fire that had scarred his face. He had built this ranch from nothing, working 18-hour days and slowly accumulating the land and livestock that now made him one of the most successful ranchers in the county. But success had not brought him happiness, and the scars on his face seemed to serve as a constant reminder of all he had lost. The ranch hands were a diverse group of men, each with their own story of hardship and second chances. There was Miguel, a former vaquero from Mexico who had an almost mystical way with horses. Old Pete, not the wagon driver but a weathered cowboy who had worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana. Young Billy, barely 18, who had come west after his family's farm failed back in Ohio. They all treated Thomas with a mixture of respect and genuine affection. And Eliza began to understand that whatever his personal demons, he was a fair and generous employer. It was Miguel who first told her about the fire. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when he approached, his hat in his hands and a serious expression on his weathered face. "Say, Ora," he said quietly. "I think you should know about the patron. About what happened to him." Eliza set down the shirt she was holding and gave him her full attention. "I know there was a fire," she said carefully, "and that his wife died." Miguel nodded gravely. "SC, but it was not just any fire. It was started by men who wanted to drive him from his land. They came in the night, thinking the house was empty, but Sarah was there alone. Thomas was checking on the cattle in the far pasture." His voice dropped to a whisper. By the time he saw the flames and rode back, the whole house was burning. He went in anyway again and again until he found her. But she was already. He shook his head sadly. The men who did this, Eliza asked, her voice tight with anger, were they caught? They left the territory that same night. Cowards, all of them. But Thomas, he rebuilt everything. Made it stronger, better. He is a good man, Siora, but he carries much pain. Perhaps now with you here he can find some peace. As the days passed, Eliza found herself watching Thomas more carefully, seeing beyond the scars to the man beneath. She noticed how gently he handled the horses, how patiently he taught young Billy the skills he would need to become a real cowboy, how he always made sure his men were well fed and fairly paid. She saw the way he would stand at the window in the evenings, looking out at the prairie with an expression of profound loneliness. And she began to understand that his careful distance from her was not rejection but protection. He was afraid of being hurt again, afraid of caring too much for someone who might leave him. The night before their wedding, Eliza stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit prairie. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Blackwood, bound by law and custom to a man she barely knew. The arrangement felt cold and businesslike, devoid of the love and partnership she had once dreamed of. But as she watched Thomas emerge from the barn and walk slowly toward the house, she felt an unexpected stirring of sympathy for him. He seemed as trapped by circumstances as she was, seeking companionship and normalcy in the only way he knew how. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Miss Carter. Thomas's voice was muffled by the wood. Might I have a word with you? She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, still fully dressed despite the late hour. His hair was tousled, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Of course, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. He remained in the doorway, his hands clasped behind his back. I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow, he said quietly, to make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. This marriage, it's not what either of us might have chosen under different circumstances, but I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to make it bearable for you. Bearable, Eliza repeated, surprised by the word choice. I know what I am, Thomas said, his hand moving unconsciously to his scarred cheek. What I look like. I know that no woman would choose me freely, not when there are whole men available. But I promise you'll be treated with respect and kindness. You'll have security, comfort, and freedom to pursue your own interests. I won't be a burden to you. Eliza felt something crack open in her chest at the pain in his voice. Thomas, she said softly, you're not a burden. And your scars, they don't define you. I've seen how you run this ranch, how your men respect you, how you've built something beautiful from nothing. That's who you are. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Thank you, he said simply, for saying that, for being here. He paused, then added, I hope that in time, we might find some measure of companionship in this arrangement. Perhaps even friendship. I'd like that, Eliza replied and meant it. The wedding ceremony was brief and functional, performed by an elderly preacher who asked no questions and offered no romantic flourishes. Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto Eliza's finger, and she did the same for him. They were husband and wife now, bound together by necessity rather than love, but bound nonetheless. The few witnesses were ranch hands and neighboring families, and the celebration afterward was modest but warm. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Eliza found herself alone with Thomas in the parlor. The fire burned low in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls. They sat in comfortable chairs across from each other, the distance between them feeling both respectful and somehow sad. Well, Thomas said, raising a glass of whiskey. Heirs to new beginnings. Eliza lifted her own glass, filled with the elderberry wine that Mrs. Henderson had made. To making the best of what we have, she said. They drank in silence, and Eliza felt the weight of the moment settling around them. She was a married woman now, with a home and security, but also with a stranger for a husband and a future that remained uncertain. As she watched Thomas stare into the fire, she wondered what he was thinking, what hopes and fears he carried into this new chapter of his life. The weeks that followed established a pattern of careful coexistence. They shared meals and conversations about the ranch, the weather, and practical matters. Thomas was intelligent and well-read, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally broke through his reserved demeanor. Eliza began to see glimpses of the man he might have been before tragedy had marked him, and she found herself drawn to those moments of unexpected warmth. She threw herself into the work of managing the household, finding satisfaction in creating order and comfort. The kitchen became her domain, and she took pride in preparing meals that nourished both Thomas and the ranch hands. She expanded the vegetable garden, adding herbs and flowers that brought color and life to the space around the house. Slowly, she began to feel less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged. But it was during the harsh winter months that everything changed. A blizzard struck the ranch with unprecedented fury, trapping them in the house for days. The wind howled like a living thing, and snow piled against the windows until they could barely see outside. Thomas worried constantly about the cattle, pacing the house like a caged animal and starting at every sound. The storm tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. The house grew cold despite the fire, and they found themselves sharing space more intimately than ever before. They played cards by lamplight, read aloud from the few books in Thomas's collection, and talked about their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. Gradually, the careful walls they had built between them began to crumble. On the third night of the storm, Eliza woke to find Thomas standing at the kitchen window, his shoulders rigid with tension. "I should be out there," he said without turning around. "The cattle are probably dying while I sit here safe and warm. You'd die too if you went out in this weather." Eliza replied, moving to stand beside him. "The storm will pass, and then you can assess the damage. Sarah used to say that," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "She'd tell me not to worry so much, that things would work out." He turned to face her, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide his scars. "She died because I wasn't there, because I was out worrying about cattle instead of being with her when she needed me." Eliza felt her heart crack open at the pain in his voice. "What happened?" "Fire started in the kitchen while I was working late in the barn. By the time I saw the flames, the whole house was engulfed. I got her out, but she was already badly burned. She died 3 days later." His hand moved unconsciously to his scarred cheek. "I got these trying to save her, but it wasn't enough." Without thinking, Eliza reached out and gently touched his scarred face. He flinched at first, but then leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if he were savoring the contact. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. "You did everything you could. I married you for all the wrong reasons," he said, opening his eyes to look at her. "I thought I could replace what I lost, fill the emptiness with something that looked like what I used to have. But you're not Sarah, and this isn't the same." "No," Eliza agreed, her hand still cupping his face. "It's not the same, but maybe it could be something different. Something real." The storm raged for 2 more days, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They talked as they never had before, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams and their fears. Thomas told her about his plans for the ranch, his hope of leaving something lasting behind. Eliza spoke of her love for literature and learning, her desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. They discovered that they shared a love of music, and Thomas brought out a violin that had belonged to his father, playing simple melodies that filled the house with unexpected beauty. When the storm finally broke, they emerged into a world transformed by snow and ice. The cattle had survived better than expected, huddled together in the shelter of the barn and the natural windbreaks of the landscape. But more importantly, Thomas and Eliza had found something they hadn't expected, the beginnings of genuine affection. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. A neighboring rancher, Jake Morrison, had been eyeing Thomas's land for years, and with the backing of a cattle syndicate from back east, he began making increasingly aggressive moves to force Thomas out. He cut fences, diverted water, and spread rumors about Thomas's ability to manage his affairs. The pressure was constant and wearing, but Thomas refused to be intimidated. Eliza found herself drawn into the conflict, not as a passive observer but as an active participant. She had a quick mind for business and a talent for organization that proved invaluable. She suggested consolidating resources with other small ranchers, creating a collective that could stand against Morrison's syndicate. She wrote letters to potential allies, organized meetings, and helped develop strategies for legal and economic resistance. "You don't have to do this," Thomas told her one evening as she worked on correspondence by lamplight. "This isn't your fight, isn't it?" she replied, looking up from her writing. "This is my home now, too. Our home. I won't let anyone take it from us." The word "us" hung in the air between them, laden with new meaning. They were no longer just 2 people sharing a house out of necessity. They were partners in every sense of the word. The realization brought a warmth to Thomas's face that she had never seen before, and he moved to stand behind her chair, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The battle with Morrison and his syndicate stretched through the summer and into the fall. There were moments of genuine danger, nighttime raids on cattle, sabotaged equipment, and threats of violence. But the collective of small ranchers that Eliza had helped organize proved resilient and resourceful. They supported each other through the crisis, sharing resources and standing guard over each other's property. The turning point came when Morrison overplayed his hand. In a desperate attempt to force Thomas out, he orchestrated a stampede that was meant to destroy the ranch's prize breeding stock. But Thomas had anticipated the move, and he and his allies were ready. They turned the stampede back on Morrison's own cattle, and in the chaos that followed, Morrison was caught red-handed in an act of sabotage that even the corrupt local sheriff couldn't ignore. The victory was sweet but costly. Thomas had been injured in the confrontation, taking a bullet in the shoulder that left him weak and fevered. Eliza nursed him through the worst of it, sitting by his bedside for days, changing bandages and spooning broth between his lips. It was during those long hours of tending to him that she realized how completely her feelings had changed. "I love you," she whispered one night when she thought he was sleeping. "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about you." Thomas's eyes opened, and he reached for her hand. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't think I could love anyone again after Sarah, but you've shown me that the heart has room for more than one great love in a lifetime." Their second wedding was nothing like their first. This time, it was a celebration rather than a transaction, surrounded by friends and neighbors who had become like family through their shared struggles. Eliza wore a dress of blue silk that Thomas had ordered from Denver, and she carried wildflowers from their own prairie. When they exchanged vows, the words carried the weight of genuine commitment and hard-won love. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. Thomas and Eliza expanded their operation, adding new pastures and improving their breeding program. They became leaders in the ranching community, advocates for fair practices and sustainable land management. Eliza started a school for the children of the area, teaching them not just reading and arithmetic, but also the value of hard work and integrity. But perhaps their greatest achievement was the family they built together. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived on a snowy February morning. She was followed by two sons, Samuel and David, who grew up strong and straight under the wide Montana sky. The children knew nothing of the arrangement that had brought their parents together. They only knew that their home was filled with love, laughter, and the constant presence of two people who had chosen each other again and again. Thomas's scars never faded, but they became just another part of the face that Eliza loved. She would trace them with her fingertips in the quiet moments before sleep, marveling at how something that had once seemed like a mark of loss had become a symbol of survival and resilience. He had been wounded but not broken, marked but not defeated. Years passed, and their hair turned gray, their hands grew weathered, and their children grew up and started families of their own. But the love that had grown between them remained as strong as ever, perhaps stronger for having been tested by time and circumstance. They had learned that love wasn't just about passion and romance, it was about choosing to stand together through whatever life brought, supporting each other through triumph and disaster alike. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Thomas and Eliza stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the prairie that had become their world. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and the sound of their grandchildren's laughter drifted from the yard where they played. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked, his arm around Eliza's waist. "Coming here? Marrying me for all the wrong reasons." Eliza leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth of his love surrounding her like a shelter against the world. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "I came here to survive, but I found something much more precious than mere survival. I found a home, a purpose, and a love that I never imagined possible, even though you had to trade yourself to get it." "I didn't trade myself," she said, turning to face him. "I traded my old life, my small dreams, my limited expectations. In return, I got a bigger life than I ever dared to hope for. I got you, our children, this land, this community. I got to become a person I never could have been anywhere else." The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and Thomas pulled her closer, "I used to think I was offering you security in exchange for companionship," he said. "I never realized that what I was really offering was the chance for both of us to become more than we were alone." Eliza smiled, remembering the frightened, desperate woman who had climbed down from Pete's wagon all those years ago. That woman had been willing to trade her freedom for survival, but she had ended up gaining a freedom she had never known existed. The freedom to love and be loved completely, to build something meaningful with her life, to be part of something larger than herself. The wind picked up, carrying the familiar sense of sage and cattle, of home and belonging. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to speak of the wildness that still lived in the land, the untamed spirit that had drawn them both to this place. But they had found a way to make a life here, to create order and beauty and love in the midst of the vast, indifferent landscape. As they stood together on the porch, Thomas and Eliza knew that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more joys and sorrows to share. Their children would face their own struggles and triumphs, and the ranch would continue to demand its daily portion of sweat and dedication. But they would face it all together, as they had faced everything else, with courage, with love, and with the unshakable certainty that they belonged to each other and to this place. The scarred rancher and the woman who had traded herself for survival had found something neither had expected: a home that was built not just of wood and stone, but of shared dreams, mutual respect, and a love that had grown stronger with each passing season. They had both been wounded by life before they found each other, but their wounds had become the source of their greatest strength, the ability to recognize real love when it appeared, and the wisdom to nurture it with patience and dedication. In the end, Eliza had not traded herself at all. She had invested herself in a future that she could never have imagined, and the returns had been beyond her wildest dreams. She had come to the Broken Arrow Ranch as a desperate woman with few options, but she had become the heart of a thriving family and community. She had learned that sometimes the most important trades in life are the ones where you give up what you think you want in order to discover what you truly need. The moon rose full and bright over the Montana prairie, illuminating the ranch house, where a love story had unfolded in ways neither participant could have predicted. It was a love story born of necessity but nurtured by choice, marked by struggle but defined by triumph. And as Thomas and Eliza finally went inside to begin another night of the life they had built together, they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that they had created something rare and precious. A partnership that had transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful and strong.